Sorry about that. I got cut off. Don't be surprised. That may happen again. Actually, definitely will happen again as we go through here. So if it just gets cut off, just come back to the next slide set. So we were talking about things that can affect aggregate demand, and we mentioned that consumption is obviously one thing that could affect aggregate demand. We already talked about expectation of future prices. Now we were saying that expectations of future income could increase consumption. Just think of it this way. Somebody who's not quite a doctor yet, they may buy a more expensive house based on the fact that they believe once they graduate from medical school, they'll become a doctor, and therefore consumption goes up. So expectation of future income, if you think it's going to increase, could increase consumption now and therefore increase aggregate demand. Opposite can hold true as well. Interest rates increasing. That would most likely lead to people saving more and thus consuming less, and aggregate demand would fall. The opposite holds true as well. Interest rates decline. It would probably lead to more consumption and an increase in aggregate demand. Income taxes increasing. Just think about it from your own perspective. Income taxes increase. Your consumption most likely would fall, and therefore aggregate demand would fall. Income taxes decreasing, on the other hand, would work the opposite way. I'm sorry, I'm going through this relatively quickly, but I think I need to in order to expedite this process the best that I can. Interest rates increasing. Now we're moving on to investment. So everything we've talked about thus far is affecting aggregate demand. We talked about consumption. The next, if you remember the equation, C plus I plus G plus X plus M, is investment. Interest rates would also affect investment, and it would affect investment in a similar manner. Interest rates increase, investment would most likely fall, and therefore aggregate demand would fall. And the opposite holds true as well. If you're optimistic about future sales as a company, investment most likely would increase, and therefore aggregate demand would increase. But if you're pessimistic about future sales, most likely investment would decrease, and therefore aggregate demand would decrease. Business taxes work the same way as taxes on us. If taxes are lowered, investment most likely would increase, and therefore aggregate demand would increase. If business taxes are increased, investment most likely would decrease, and therefore aggregate demand would decrease. Then they skip here the government part. C plus I is what we talked about so far. They don't really talk about G because we're going to talk about that extensively in chapters 9 and 10. So they go right into trade. So let's go into that. If foreign real national income increases, most likely that means exports would increase, which would lead to more net exports, and therefore aggregate demand would increase. If foreign real national income decreases, exports would most likely decrease, and therefore net exports would decrease, and therefore aggregate demand would decrease. If the US dollar depreciates, what that means is that if our dollar weakens against foreign currencies, or foreign currencies appreciate against our currency, that most likely would lead to a situation where exports would increase and imports would decrease. And the reason for that is, for exports increasing, is because our dollar is now cheaper, and imports, we wouldn't want to buy abroad as much because our goods are cheaper. So net exports would increase, aggregate demand would increase. The opposite holds true as well if the US dollar appreciates. So we mentioned several factors that could change aggregate demand. The main thing for your guys' knowledge is that equation, C plus I plus G plus X plus M, anything that could affect those variables could affect aggregate demand. And we went through a variety of them over here. This is a good slide that kind of summarizes everything that we've discussed up until now as far as what could affect aggregate demand. Now we're going to move on to aggregate supply, and this gets a little tricky because in aggregate supply, we're now going to talk about the concept of short run versus long run. The tricky part about aggregate supply is aggregate supply will have a short run and a long run curve. Aggregate demand does not have a short run and long run curve. Only aggregate supply does. Okay? So that's definitely something you have to know. Short run only applies to aggregate supply. Long run only is really applying to aggregate supply as far as different curves. So let's just define. Aggregate supply is the quantity supplied of all goods and services, real GDP at different price levels. The short run aggregate supply curve is a curve that shows the quantity supplied of all goods and services, real GDP at different price levels. Now, the key term short run means, probably you already kind of have an idea. It means in the short run, in the more recent, what we expect to happen soon. Long run is obviously well out in the future. Okay, so the short run aggregate supply curve looks exactly like the supply curve that we saw in Chapter 3. It's an upward sloping curve, specifying a direct relationship between the price level and real GDP. So why does the aggregate supply curve slope upward? There's two possible explanations. And just like the explanations for why the demand curve sloped downward, this is not relevant for the quiz. I'm going to go over them, but it's not relevant for the quiz. Sticky wages and worker misconceptions are the two reasons, which are not relevant for the quiz, why the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So first, let's go through sticky wages. Wages are locked in for a few years due to labor contracts or perhaps the notions of social conventions or perceived notions of fairness. While firms pay nominal wages, they often decide how many workers to hire based on real wages. So let's go through a little bit of this here. So the real wage is equal to the nominal wage divided by the price level. Once again, all this stuff is just for your knowledge. It's not going to be on the quiz. The price as the price level increases, real wages typically fall. So in other words, as inflation increases, your wage that you make right now in real terms, meaning inflation adjusted terms, goes down. And as the price level decreases, your real wage, whatever you make on an annual basis, goes up. More individuals are willing to work, and current workers are willing to work more at higher real wages than lower real wages, and vice versa. Therefore, as the real wage increases, quantity supplied of labor increases. So in other words, real wage increases, more people want to work. And as the real wage decreases, quantity supplied of labor decreases. So firms will employ more workers the cheaper it is to hire them. So as the real wage increases, the quantity of labor demanded, how much the employers want, goes down. And as the real wage decreases, the quantity of labor demanded increases. Thus, if wages are sticky, I'll get to that in a second, an increase in the price level, which pushes real wages down, will result in an increase in output. And that's why you see an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. As the price level rises, the quantity supplied of goods and services rises. And the opposite occurs if price level falls. So, in other words, if wages are sticky, what does that mean? It means that wages are stagnant. They don't fluctuate a lot. Generally, in a recession, wages are considered sticky because prices may fall during a recession, but you don't see employers often cutting wages. I know that it happened in the recent recession, but it doesn't happen frequently, and that's the point. It's harder to lower wages than it is to lower your prices. Anyway, this is one of the reasons why you see an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Another reason why you see this upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve is worker misconceptions. If workers misperceive real wage changes, then a fall in the price level will bring about a decline in output, which is illustrative of the short-run aggregate supply curve. In response to the misperceived falling real wage, workers may reduce the quantity of labor they are willing to supply, and with fewer workers, firms will end up producing less. So, Here we're looking at our changes in short run aggregate supply. Before we looked at two reasons why the curve is upward sloping. Now we're looking at changes, and we've talked about this in the past. If there's an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve, or if there's an increase in supply, it is a movement to the right. If it's a decrease in the short run aggregate supply curve or a decrease in the supply, it's a movement to the left. Okay? So, the shift in the short run aggregate supply curve can be caused by changes in wage rates, prices of non-labor inputs, productivity, supply shocks, whether they be adverse or beneficial. Think about this like, there's a tsunami and we're looking at Japan's GDP. Well, when there was a tsunami in Japan, clearly a lot of businesses were knocked out. Therefore, aggregate supply for Japan decreased. That sort of thing. So these are the things that can affect short-run aggregate supply. If wage rates fall, short-run aggregate supply would increase. If prices of non-labor inputs decrease, short-run aggregate supply would increase. Productivity, if it increases, short-run aggregate supply would increase. And if there's a beneficial supply shock, I was speaking of something that was a negative supply shock, but if it's a beneficial supply shock, short-run aggregate supply curve would increase. And then, of course, if you have the opposites occur, the short-run aggregate supply curve would decrease. All right, short-run equilibrium. I'm going to take a break here, and I'm going to start in our next little video with this. So we'll see you then.